I don't think death is the end, because I believe in all sorts of other things. I just don't think I'll be in this body.
I think all too often we've become accustomed to thinking of death and dying as existing within the realm of medicine. But I believe firmly that it exists within the realm of us as human beings.
Results at the present don't seem to show any growth or any change or anything like that. So from that perspective, it's really good. But then there's always that niggle of, but what if?
Death and dying is the final common pathway. Everybody will die at some point. And therefore, if you like, it is the one thing that affects the entire population.
Death was something that was very much an everyday event. It was a public experience. People died at home. Their bodies were often taken through the streets of the village, maybe to get from, well, wherever they were going, or to the place where they were going to be buried. Part of the everyday fabric of life.
When I was a child, my elderly neighbour, died on the street in front of my eyes. I must have been 6 or 7. And the women of the neighbourhood, I ran to my mum and told her that our neighbour had keeled over in the street, and I thought she was dead. And my mum and the other neighbours all came out, and they knew what to do. You know, it's etched on my mind as a child to see these women holding a mirror over her face to see whether she was breathing. Nobody rushed to the ambulance. It was somehow, there wasn't a panic. Nobody felt the need to save her life. She was a very elderly, frail woman who'd just died.
Dying is something that we're all going to have to deal with. But yet it is something that's incredibly taboo and people find very difficult to talk about. And I think it's something that's very wound up in our culture. Other cultures in the world where it's not seen in quite the same taboo way. Those conversations are much more open, and people don't fear death in quite the same way as what we do. And with that, I think what's been created, and this is only my opinion, is almost psychological response to the conceptualization of death. We fear it because we don't discuss it and it's taboo, so we deny it to ourselves as an almost protective mechanism. I think the only way to get around that is to open the conversation. Dying Matters is a fantastic campaign who are really trying to open up that conversation. Really try and put death into modern society in a way that makes it easier and more comfortable to deal with. For Dying Matters Week last week, we actually ran a death cafe for our members, and we had the idea is that you have a cake and everyone comes around and just talks about death. We also had some music and a choir singing, and just to really open up that conversation, because obviously one of the things people like to talk about for their own funeral, for example, is the fact that they are what music they're going to have, what represents them, and I'd never been to one of these before, but it was a really, really interesting experience having all these different people from different backgrounds talking about death for the first time, and it was certainly the first time I'd spoken about it openly.
John Underwood, who first set this movement rolling, I think was pretty inspired, because he created a format, a structure, where anybody could set up a death cafe and invite people to come, with it being very clearly on the agenda. This is what this evening is about. This is what we're doing here. And the beauty, I think, is that people have responded. There are hundreds and hundreds of death cafes all over the world now. And it's a safe, held environment. where people are invited to consider it from all sorts of different perspectives. And it interests me a lot, because this is what we find on our training too. The minute people are in a room and they know it's socially acceptable to talk about it, people open up and share their experiences, share their fears, and share their plans, their dreams, their wishes. It's a beautiful model, I think. So, and a lot of our doulas have gone out and do set up death cafes in their local community. So it's another way of engaging the community. It doesn't require an expert. Nobody's an expert. Everybody's there simply to explore and listen to each other.
With modernisation, industrialisation, secularisation, there's a shift. It shifts from being a kind of public experience, albeit that it might be taking place at home, but with family, neighbours in the room, etc. Dying would be taking place in that kind of everyday, familial community way, to becoming something that's far more private, ritualised, even romanticised.
In the Western world, I think there is a developing ambivalence between what, on the one hand, is represented in everyday life. We encounter death on a daily basis in social media, in the news, in our way of even using language. Death is embedded. But at the same time, in the Western world, I think we have, over the past 100 years, created a situation in which less and less people are actually close to death when death actually occurs. And this gap between immediate actual experience of death awareness and death encounter and the representation of symbolic death at the same time, deeply embedded in our culture and meaning structures, is creating a whole lot of anxiety in many people.
Everything associated with death and dying became something that was more about the person mourning than the individual dying, and that's carried on. So today, society is filled with images and stories about death and dying, fantasies that are being told on television, in soap operas or in films about individuals dying, that are very much kind of spectacular, they're very much sensationalized, they're very much about a drama of an almost extraordinary person rather than the everydayness of an unexceptional, regular individual.
How each one of us comes to handling death is an absolute reflection of how we've lived our life and how our relationships have worked in our life. You can't suddenly be speaking from your heart to somebody if you never have all your life, or it's incredibly hard. So actually it sort of rolls back. How am I living my life, and how will that then show up when I come to die?
I was 15 when I saw my first dead person. I hold a strange hand of cards. I'm a performer, a celebrant, and I run a green burial ground. The fact is, I like being with people who know they are dying. It had poured with rain when they lowered his coffin into the grave, but somehow even that felt right. A week later, clearing out the drawer of an old dresser, they found it. The letter, his final wishes. Cremation.
Fear of talking about death and dying, you could answer in all sorts of ways. People don't want to talk about it because it's the ending of what they experience in the here and now. But I think there's something else underlying this, and that's not just a worry about what happens the other side of death. We have become preoccupied in the news and in the media with treatments that prolong life. So you will never, very seldom, see anything in the news which talks about, oh, look at this fantastic way of looking after people who are dying. That's not really very newsworthy. However, you can talk about, oh, there's a new treatment for dementia or cancer will be conquered in the next 10 years. That's a good news story. So I think the whole question of isolating out death and dying as something separate and special probably is one of the reasons why we're not good at talking about it. If we talked about living lives well, if we looked at human flourishing, which was just as important for somebody who is frail and elderly and coming to the end of their natural biological life, maybe even if we had a different way of seeing older people, then that would somehow change the way in which we engaged with these things. Because our modern society is prioritised with people looking young and staying young, and by definition that means not dying. So the whole thrust of society now is about pretending that we're not dying. So it's not surprising that people don't look at this until it's almost too late. And when they do, they're so terrified that there's been a whole life that's led that has not prepared them for this time. So it's kind of denial big time.
I guess the other thing that has shocked me, I must say, is some of the stories about the degree of denial that people encounter. The sort of desperate desire to open some kind of dialogue with a family member and it really being impossible to do so. I've had people, in tears talking about this to me. And though I do come across it in my work here, perhaps some of the people that have chosen to come to a green burial ground are making a few steps in certain ways in the way they think about things. And that's really shocked and saddened me.
I was diagnosed in 2014 with bowel cancer, which was a real shock. Had surgery, keyhole surgery, thought that was it. Going back for tests because they just keep an eye on you. And I was fine for 18 months, nearly 2 years. And then they found some marks in my liver. So that was in 2016. So I had to go and have my liver removed, or part of it anyway, which was fine. Thought nothing more of it. And then in the November 2016, they found that I had lesions, whatever they call them, on my lungs, which was basically incurable. They said they can treat them, but they won't ever get rid of them. And basically I was now in palliative care, long-term palliative care.
I think that most people conflate the two terms. So many people think palliative care is end-of-life care and vice versa, without realising that one is about treating symptoms and managing pain, and the other about dying with dignity. I think that people need to be more aware about what those two types of care are, their functions are, but also how they can be provided as well. So many people aren't aware that your end-of-life care can be provided at home as opposed to in a hospital. Many people just think it's about pain management and not about the other aspects of care. And many people don't realise that family members can also be in receipt of that care as well, to increase the quality of life for everyone in and around the person who's received the diagnosis. The only way that can happen is by opening that conversation up in society and looking for those opportunities rather than being responsive when people are, when they receive their diagnosis.
Recently, I attended a conference at the Uganda Cancer Institute, and there were a range of different speakers. They were celebrating 10 years of being in operation. So that's, for cancer services in a low resource setting, that's great. And there's one speaker there, Dr. Raju Gopal. He's seen as the father of palliative care in India, made massive strides in terms of making it accessible to people. And he made the point about what is healthcare providing people at the moment. And there was a statement he made that was quite nice, that poor people die in misery from neglect. Middle class people die in misery from ignorance, and rich people die in misery on ventilators. And the idea that healthcare throws everything at people for cure, and that's kind of something at a societal level maybe we've come to expect in terms of cancer treatments. They are getting better, and for certain cancers, and people want cure. There's a whole military metaphor that's emerging around cancer. Sort of we can fight cancer, win the war. And those types of things that are often there's good intention behind them, but the impact that might have on a patient, particularly when a cancer is no longer treatable, you move into an incurable state, what impact that has on a patient is very difficult. So Dr. Roger Gopal was questioning what healthcare tries to deliver, and I guess palliative care is put forward as a model for what healthcare should look like, not just focusing on a physical illness that so many areas of healthcare do, but thinking more broadly about what's the psychological impact of this illness, what's the social impact, what's the spiritual impact, what do we class as healthcare, and sort of using palliative care as a model for guiding healthcare delivery in all areas, not just looking at patients with progressive and terminal illnesses.
A lot of people confuse palliative care and end-of-life care, and palliative care is the overarching approach. It's almost a philosophy of care. Our focus is to help people get from chaotic situations to some sense of containment, to managing uncertainty, to getting some control back, and to help them so far as we can deal with the physical consequences of their illness, distress, pain, breathlessness, other types of symptoms, many of which are actually affected as much by what a person is feeling than what actually is happening in their body.
In terms of what palliative care should provide, and does provide in many cases, is support for a patient with a progressive illness. And I see it as that a patient experiencing that process of dying and being supported well, but surrounding the patient, you have the family, you have caregivers, and equally their needs are so crucial, particularly in conditions such as dementia, where a patient's condition might progress to the stage where families and caregivers become the main form of communication and advocate for a patient. In terms of once death happens, that is ultimately experienced by families and caregivers.
End-of-life care is a phrase in the UK. It was really developed in terms of the end-of-life care strategy. The working definition of that is about people who are likely to be in their last 12 months of life. Obviously, depending on what condition you're in, that 12 months, as it were, is more or less relevant and more or less applicable. But also in the last year of life, it's a way of thinking about, well, might this person die in the next 12 months? And therefore, is their death, if you like, that kind of close? And it's a way of thinking about planning for it. However, some people think of end-of-life care as being the very end of life, as in last days, hours of life. We tend to refer to that period as the dying period, and therefore to try and make that clear distinction. Last phase of life is a phrase that some people have introduced. It isn't that widely used. It just introduces yet another terminology into it, trying to get away from the 12-month definition, but still meaning pretty much the same thing. So I think it is more helpful to think of palliative care in terms of the approach to care, and then to think of end-of-life care, certainly in this country, is thinking about the last year of life-ish.
It's quite a hard subject. I mean, I do talk about it offhandedly. So they know about my project book. They know that I'm not going to go quietly. My son has always said, if I don't tell him stuff, he doesn't have to worry about it. So when I'm in hospital, he rings to see how I am always, but and comes up, but he doesn't like to know the nitty-gritty, whereas my daughter wants to know everything, absolutely everything. And my husband doesn't talk about it very much. He's, I think, A couple of weeks ago, I was in hospital and I came out, and then 2 days later, they had to call an ambulance because I'd obviously wasn't well enough to come out. The infection hadn't cleared up, and he thought I was going to die. He literally thought I was going to die. I don't remember much of it, but he did say afterwards, I thought that was it. I literally thought that was it. So I think that scared him quite a bit.
It's a case of, we have to carry on. We carry on for each other. We carry on for the children. To give up, you might just sort of curl up in the corner and die yourself. I mean, there is life. You have to be positive. There have been so many advances, in recent years, sort of medical science, and particularly in the, sort of the cancer field, that miracles do happen. Miracle, believing in something. It could turn up tomorrow. I think because I'm so positive and I think I've got years to go, I must admit that the passing out and having an ambulance come terrified me, thinking back on it. And at the time when I felt myself collapsing, I just thought, I don't want to go yet, I haven't finished.
I want to live with her, just so I'm there. But obviously, I'm married, I have a child. It's not really the normal thing to do, but I would try and spend all of my time with her. Like, I don't care. Like, I'd rather spend the time with her now than not have it. Even if we do argue. But what mother and daughter relationship doesn't argue? We all keep it as normal as possible, so if someone's annoyed with someone, we're going to say it. We're not going to be, oh, well, we can't say that because mum's got cancer. She doesn't want it like that at all. Like, her having cancer, I mean, personally, it's just like a word. She doesn't look ill. She doesn't feel ill. But obviously she is ill. So people find it really hard when she goes into the hospital and she looks normal. And I'm like, you're not. My point of view is, regardless of whether she looks like she's got cancer, she has got cancer, and people need to know that if they're not going to treat her as if she's got cancer, then there's going to be issues. And I know that sounds aggressive, but, I would walk to the end of the earth to cure her.
I think I have to be humble in the role of being a professional in hospice and palliative care. I cannot talk about preparation for death. I think our prerogative and remit is to help other people in their dying process. And I think it's a very important distinction. Because death is implying a lot of transcendental questions, a lot of questions around spirituality, religiosity. It has a lot to do with what type of symbolic immortality ideas a certain person has, and it's an ultimately extremely intimate and personal question. So, although we can facilitate conversations around it, and we can, as professionals, try to be as open as possible about another person's understanding of death, I guess where we and I are much better at is finding a way of communicating about and around the dying process. So what kind of thoughts and ideas do you have around your own dying process? How do you imagine your own death? What kind of fears and anxieties do you have? But maybe also what kind of hopes and wishes do you have? how would you like to prepare your own dying process? Or do you not want to prepare it at all? Do you want to have a fulminant and very intense dying process? Or do you feel like you shouldn't be talking about this at all because by the end of the day, a force much bigger than you will make the decision for you?
I don't know how looking at me now, but I just think because we're so close, like, if anything was to happen, she would be there in me. And I think with me, like, where she says I'll be the one to look after Dad, because she's Dad's world.
I think there's a huge responsibility on service providers to ensure that that patients and staff and families working in and around palliative and end-of-life care are really aware of the services that are available to them.
Well, I've been on dialysis now for about 12 months. I have 2 daughters who, thanks to them, enable me to dialyse at home. It was hard having to go to the hospital virtually every other day, 3-4 times a week. Thankfully, they help a lot, and it makes it much easier to bear. I stopped working about 6 months ago. I was aware that this may happen some while back, so I prepared myself to leave work early. And then now I concentrate on dialysis and generally been happy, really. Ideally, I need to lose another 7 kilos. If I lose 7 kilos, then I make the list with the other 5,000 that are on the list. I mean, it's irrelevant that there's 5,000 because you're called at random. Suddenly something becomes available that's suitable for you, then you're called in. But generally the prognosis, while I stay on dialysis, it's not great. I mean, I believe it's something like a maximum of 10, 12 years if I don't get a kidney. If I do get a kidney eventually, I would live a relatively normal life.
Palliative care as an approach was initially developed to cater for the needs of patients with certain severe illnesses, for example, advanced cancer and motor neuron disease. Over the past few decades, it's been increasingly recognised that palliative care can be of benefit for people with a range of conditions. This includes cancer, but also lots of other serious illnesses, such as those affecting the heart, the lungs, or the nervous system. We know from our research that the need for palliative care is set to increase significantly over the next few decades. This is for a variety of reasons, including the fact that people are generally living for longer, but also living with multiple illnesses. It's therefore vital that palliative care services are supported to expand as required, and also that we continue to provide education and training for colleagues in other specialties.
My ear nurse told me about them. I knew about the Isabel Hospice, but I didn't know that they had other things. I thought they were just a hospice and it was just end-of-life care. I didn't realise they had all these other functions that they could help with. They had all these other little departments. I mean, I've had therapy through them. They've been really helpful and really there. And, you know, I've booked myself in for when my time comes, because I don't want to put my family through me dying in their home. I don't think I could do that to them. And I know, you know, I know people that have been cared for with the Isabel Hospice, and I know that they've been cared for magnificently, and not just the patients, the family as well. And I'm hoping that when my time comes, that's all happen for me.
So, how did things start at St Christopher's? Well, Cicely Saunders, her story is well known within the movement, and to a degree aspects are known more broadly. But essentially, Cicely Saunders was a woman who started life in nursing. She encountered and was troubled enormously by the suffering that she was seeing, particularly pain that was uncontrolled, and the care of people who were dying, not being treated with respect and dignity. And over the course of her own development and professional life, she was a nurse, then she was a social worker, then she was a doctor. And in that sense, she did that in order to have the experience, but also the authority to speak into this situation. And she then set up in 1967 the hospice here at St Christopher's. And that essentially was to look after people who were dying. Palliative care has got much broader now than that. And so this is considered the place where the modern hospice movement started. There were actually institutions before that. St Joseph's, for example, in East London was going for substantially longer. But this really was the place for the beginning of the modern hospice movement. And the priority at those times was people who were dying with cancer, who were in pain. And so probably the most unique contribution that Cicely Saunders made was actually to define or articulate what she called total pain. And what she meant by that was the way in which pain was just not an expression of a physical problem, but it was the output or the integration of the distress that was associated with suffering. In this case, suffering that was going to lead to death. And so she described it as physical pain, emotional pain, and spiritual pain. So physical pain, whatever the pathology is that's going on and causing the problem. Emotional pain, which is the pain of passing, the pain of not having resolved your relationships, the pain, if you like, of not having said the goodbyes, sorries and thank yous. The pain associated with alive relationships with people who've already died, or the pain associated with processing relationships that have failed but the people are still alive and you can't resolve them. And then the third part of the pain was the what in those days was described as spiritual pain. We'd probably call it existential pain now to, as it were, remove the religious connotation, but essentially it's the same thing. And that is the question of whether my life has amounted to much. What I have done well and what I've done badly. How I've failed myself, how I've failed others. And of course, for all human beings, the question of whether death is the end or whether there's something beyond death. And that for many people, depending upon the cultures they come from, expresses itself in a variety of ways. So one of the ways in which it may be expressed in what is historically a Christian nation like this one is the question of meeting my maker. Linked to this also, within total pain, is the question that we all ask, which is, why is this happening to me? is this a consequence of what I've done? Is this a consequence of what's been done to me? Or is this just some horrible mishap? And it's all of those things mashed together that leads to total pain.
At the moment, it seems chaplaincy services are perhaps perceived by the public as something that is wholly religious, but we know that a chaplaincy service is there to provide pastoral, spiritual and religious care. And it's really important that patients in particular are informed about how inclusive that service is, what spiritual and pastoral care is, and how it can benefit them. And there's an onus on the providers to ensure that individuals who are receiving palliative and end-of-life care and those around them are fully aware of what the service is and the support that it can provide. We provide pastoral care in much the same way as chaplains, which as religious chaplains would. We meet people where they're at. We don't go in with an agenda or to promote humanism or to give advice or try and just cheer people up. We're there to provide a listening ear, to walk alongside the person whilst they're working through their difficult times and facing these difficult points in their life. I remember someone just recently, they were telling me about a gay man that they'd met in a hospital ward. He was just about to die. He'd actually come from quite a religious community when he was younger, and when he came out as gay, he'd had some quite challenging experiences with that community and being shunned by that community as well. And when he was offered support by the chaplaincy team, he felt he really wanted someone to speak to, but again, he didn't feel like it was appropriate for him because of the experiences that he'd had. And when he found out there was someone non-religious he could speak to, we were able to go down, meet with him on several different occasions, and in those final days of his life, really give him a little bit of comfort. And obviously, it's never as much as the pain reliever as what a doctor or a nurse is providing or anything like that. But it does give people some level of well-being, and gave him some comfort in those final days. And that's really important for us, is that when we are providing support, is that it's, you're meeting the person right where they are, and taking them on a journey and going with them on a journey together.
Well, an end-of-life doula is a companion, really, fundamentally, and somebody who doesn't have a medical background. So a doula might come from any walk of life, and they would have a particular feeling of connection, perhaps, with death and dying. They might have had an experience of caring for a relative or a friend that's either been fantastic, interesting, people don't think death can be fantastic, or awful. And sometimes people have an impulse or a feeling that I can be with people who are dying and I don't feel bad about that. So our training is really drawing on all kinds of people who have a normal, ordinary life, not medically trained, not trained as carers even sometimes, who feel they have a contribution that they'd like to make to support someone to die well and to be a consistent companion, someone who can respond on a practical level, emotional, spiritual level, even if that's what's required.
This burial ground is one of over 360 in the United Kingdom now, which is astonishingly exciting when you think that the first one was in Carlisle in 1993, and here we are in 2018 with that number existing and many more coming on each year. And what's really exciting about the Green Burial Ground movement to me is there's no one size fits all. So you can see, looking in this picture, a little bit what our site looks like. And you would go to another one and it would look much more formal, or you might go to one where it's just got sheep grazing over the top of it and you would have absolutely no idea it was a burial ground. What's exciting about being part of this movement is seeing people responding to the freedom that they can experience here and the opportunity to connect with nature. That there's so much comfort from experiencing the cycles of nature, of coming to the site through the seasons, in the autumn, the winter, the spring and the summer, to see the tree that got planted getting bigger, to see the wildflowers that come out at the different times of year, that there's so much healing and beauty in that. And if I had £1 for every time somebody came to a funeral and then sort of sidles up to me at the end and says something like, you know, when I heard it was going to be up here, I really wasn't sure that I was going to like it, but actually now I think this is what I want. It's just about people getting to understand what's available. And it's not right for everybody. Absolutely not. But for the people it's right for, it is so right.
So often the phrase which is stated when you see a chaplaincy team in one of these institutional settings is, we're there for all faiths and none. But the reality is that the research that we conducted on a London hospital was that only about 4% of chaplaincy visits were to non-religious people. Now, this is not because the chaplains were refusing to go and speak to the non-religious. It's because non-religious people haven't been trying to access support from the chaplains. I think many non-religious people see the service as a religious one, as opposed to a pastoral, spiritual and religious care service, which is what it actually is. And I think the only way to reach out to that group which aren't accessing the service is to make people aware of the broadness of the service and what it's there for, and also how it can help. The other aspect of that is by having like-minded providers in the service. So we really want to see not just non-religious people, but Christians and Muslims and Jews all working together to offer a complete care package to patients and families. I think it's really important that when faced with these difficult existential questions at end of life, and in other parts of people's journey in hospital, that there's Christians are able to speak to Christians, Muslims can speak to Muslims, Buddhists can speak to the Buddhists, etc., etc. And in the same way, it's important that non-religious people have the opportunity to speak to a like-minded non-religious person as well. And I think that's the only way to guarantee that that everyone will access the service that's available.
I don't think any service, any organisation, any locality sets out to provide inequality. So I think that's an important sort of thing for us to remember, is nobody sets out to do that. However, when groups are either smaller or less visible or less vocal or has less advocacy, then inevitably their access to the provision and quality of healthcare can suffer. And I think all those groups that were in the CQC report, A Different Ending, remain groups that we need to look at really closely. I think we've done some work on some of those groups. So, for example, in the prison setting, there is now a Dying Well in Prisons charter, and that's a relatively new sort of thing. For people with homelessness, we're looking at ways of trying to improve palliative and end-of-life care for people in that situation. We've also done some work around people with learning disability. So there's quite a lot, but what we can't do is adopt necessarily the same measures for all of these groups. So what we've got to do is think about what are the adjustments that are needed for a particular group, what kind of actions, interventions, reaching out that we need to do that may be very different from one group to another. But unless we pay attention to the fact that there are groups who are not getting equal access, then we won't be able to address those.
My nurses have always said, Macmillan, Isabel Hospice, they've always said that it's not just for me. If the family want to talk, then they can. If the family want to know anything, then they can. I remember saying to my nurses at one point, I don't ring you. I never ring you for anything. Am I doing something wrong? Should I be talking to you more? And they said, well, no, because you've got a good family support. that you don't need to ring us. So if you want to ring us and ask a question or, whatever, then you can. But she said, you've got a really good family network. So they're there to help. And I think they all know that they can talk to someone.
The first diagnosis for the colon cancer, the nurse was there, and we were very much taken in as a family. When we found out, I mean, it was three of us in the room. Laura, daughter Charlotte, and me, and it's a real shock. But right from that, you are considered. It's I don't know. It's a bit like maternity. I think when I was born, your husband, no one in the world, your husband would turn up to it's not men's work, but similarly, and perhaps not absolutely 100% similarly, but I mean it's it is inclusive. The support is there. I have the numbers on my phone of the various nurses, and I know I can I could call them if I felt I needed a chat. Same basically. I mean, with our GP. I mean, we actually share the same GP on the register. So obviously she's now well aware of the family and well aware of the stress that it actually causes to people other than the person that's suffering. So I mean, it's there if you need it. As is an awful lot of other support. I mean, generally sort of family groups, friend groups, office groups. Again, personally, we're the company I work for are very supportive as well through various charitable things that they do. So you don't need to be alone. It's
It's really true that how people die stays with the people who are left behind. And that can be both positive, because it was an enormously beautiful and close experience for those that were there, and it can be incredibly painful. My own father was tortured by the way his mother had died. She died in New York late at night. She was in enormous pain and he couldn't get morphine to her, and he was ringing people and nobody brought morphine. So he just watched her in intense agony finally dying, and that stayed with him all of his life, the guilt that he felt there was something he could have done. And he found it very hard to forgive himself about that. But then, these things come full circle. So when he was dying, I thought, right, I must really make sure that we have morphine. And we had morphine, and he couldn't stand the morphine. It gave him illusions, and he felt out of control, and we had to get it out of his system as quickly as we could. So there's no one way. And I think we have to learn to be kind with ourselves. There's that wonderful phrase of Winnicott's, you can only be the best kind of parent you can be, a good enough parent. Well, I think we can only be a good enough accompanier of the dying. We're not experts. One thing I think we can all try to do is learn more about it so that we're not lost and ill-informed when the time comes. But it's never going to be perfect, and we have to just let that go, let that be.
There's obviously a very now famous piece of qualitative research by an Australian nurse who asked patients exactly about that at the end of life. She was a palliative care nurse, and she sat down with them and documented what they said after she asked, what is your main regret looking back at your life and trying to make sense of what's been happening. What do you regret the most? And the interesting top 5 answers were, I wish I had lived a life much more authentic and honest to myself, and not a life that others had expected of me, which I always find a very powerful one. I think many people can really relate to this constant struggle between social expectation and personal, individual, inner voice of your own life narrative and your own ideas. The second one is, I wish I had allowed myself to be happier. A third one is something many people will be able to relate to is I wish I hadn't worked that hard. And I use this a lot in my own lectures and my own talks I give around the world when I talk about palliative care. Another one is I wish I had stayed in contact with my friends and family. I guess this is one that is particularly relevant for those who have been working very hard in their lives, who sometimes happen to find themselves in a situation where both regrets become relevant all of a sudden.
We've not necessarily spoke about what would happen, but she says she's made a list and she's wrote it all down, and she knows what she wants. And I mean, sometimes we joke about it. So, for instance, she'll say that she wants this particular song played, and and then I'll just go, well, no, I'm going to play this one. She's like, if you play that one, I'm going to come and haunt you. So I think it's all done a bit, there's no formality there, which I think is quite nice, because if there was too much formality there, then it would be like she was bowing to it and she was acknowledging, because as far as we're concerned, yes, she's got it, but she's a fighter.
Laura was one of those extraordinary people that she is an organiser. She'll have a spreadsheet for everything, including when the time comes, she actually has a project book, and in that project book is the arrangements that she wants followed for a funeral. She has arranged insurance policies to cover the cost of the funeral. We have a list of the music that will be played at her funeral. As much as I dislike Simply Red, that will be Laura's wish. And even to the point of, she doesn't want a headstone. She doesn't need a headstone. She wants her ashes sprinkled on the Mersey. So we can do it. We can go on the Mersey ferry, listen to Jerry Marsden yet again, and chuck her over the side, which it'll be great. Great celebration of Laura. As sad as it may be, and as emotional as it may be, we talk about it. Well, rather we don't talk about it, we listen to what Laura wants, and we'll do our best to follow what it says in the book.
But I'm also, I've always had choices. Throughout my life, I've had choices with the way I live. And I'm always going to have choices about the way I die, I hope. Because I don't ever want to be a vegetable. I don't ever want to be dependent on people looking after me. I never want to be like that. And if I have anything to do with it, I will not be. But I'm hoping that, when my time comes, I'll just go. But I don't want to end up being dependent on other people. As I've got a project book, and my project book is going to have everything in it that I want. The way my funeral, where I want to be, my will. That's going to have everything in it so that people can go to it, and it's not finished because I'm not going anywhere yet, but it's getting there. And that's, I've always said I'm organised. I like to organise things. That's the way I am. And, if there's a party, I'll do it. I organised my daughter's wedding. I love doing things like that. But possibly I'm a bit controlling. But if I'm going to die and I'm going to have a funeral and everything, then it's going to be my way. And also, if they tell me beforehand that I've got a few months, I'm having the party first, because I don't see why I should be dead and they should have a good time. So I'm having a party beforehand if they give me, a few months. So that's what's going to happen. I mean, I'm going to live. I'm going to live until the very last second, because that's all you can do.
The concept of a good death for an individual person is a very subjective one, and should ideally be discussed with that person and those important to them. We know from our experience and also the research base that there are several factors which can contribute to someone experiencing a good death. These include a sense of the person feeling that they're involved in their care and that their preferences and wishes are respected as far as possible. For example, this can be achieved by ensuring that they're looked after in their preferred place of care and that they have access to high-quality symptom control in order to ensure that they feel safe and comfortable. For many people, a sense of legacy is important, and it's vital that they are provided with the time and space to sort out their personal affairs. Many people feel a degree of comfort from knowing that their family and friends are being looked after, both during their illness and also after they die.
Well, I think it's really interesting, this whole thing about a good death. And somebody that I work with on my festival used a wonderful phrase, which is, he said, we have to be careful of the tyranny of a good death. And I think that was very, very wise. It's just like birth, you know, the tyranny of a good birth. We have this idea of how we want it to be. And in reality, we can make plans and we can prepare. And that's incredibly important in all sorts of ways. But when the process finally unfolds, we cannot be completely in control of what that looks like. And I think sometimes people suffer enormously because they have this idea of what it should look like. And it doesn't necessarily look exactly like that. That doesn't mean that I don't think there are things we can do to ease the process of dying, both for the person who's dying and people around them. And that, of course, you know, if you ask somebody what they imagined a good death would look like, they'd talk about pain control, they'd talk about nausea control, they'd talk about people being able to breathe well, and then they'd talk about the emotional stuff, that the right people were with the person at the time, that the things that needed to be said had been said. And these things are incredibly important, and we also have to just live with the imperfection that in reality maybe that person wasn't there for some reason, something wasn't said, and we have to be able to move forward and not beat ourselves up about it.
It's quite a hard subject. I mean, I do talk about it offhandedly. So they know about my project book, they know what I want now, or at least have it down in paper, so that if anything like that happens again, which hopefully it won't for a long time, they'll know what to do. But it was very scary. It was very scary. And for all of them, it was scary for me, but it was happening to me. So it's a bit different for my family, for Bash and Charlotte and Declan and their partners. It was, I think, terrifying. And probably more terrifying for them because all they can do is watch. Whereas it was happening to me, and but they're helpless, and I think that's the most terrifying thing for family, is they're helpless to do anything. They just have to watch, and just be there. And for me, that was just horrible. It was horrible putting them through that. And luckily, it wasn't the end, but to finally come through and, find out where I was and what had gone in, and their faces, not nice.
I don't want her to have to worry about anyone else. It's not about anyone else, it's about her. So long as she's peaceful and she's at ease with what is happening, then I think that's all anyone can ask for. And so long as obviously she's got me and my dad and my brother and our partners around her, then I think that's all it can be. It just you can't have palliative care if it's not calm. It's all about the end of life. So it's all about making that end of someone's life as peaceful and as happy and as don't worry about it. Don't hold back. Just literally cherish every single moment you've got with that particular person. Like, don't let any silly arguments stop you from have the argument, forget about it, move on. Like, spend as much time as you can with that person. Include them in everything that you do. Ring them every day. Tell them you love them. It's the little things, because if I didn't say to Mum, I love you, and then something happened, that wouldn't have been my last gift to her. So I always say I love her, and I always get happy to say it too. Because if anything was to happen, I wouldn't want my last word to not be that I love you. So if anyone else is going through it, just tell them you love them all the time.
But I won't worry today. Even if time flies away. Even if time flies away.
It's unlikely that hospitals or even hospices will know how to refer on, but people can contact Living Well, Dying Well, and now we have the End of Life Doula UK Association, which is the professional body for end of life doulas, and there's a referral process that they handle to introduce doulas if there's somebody in that geographical location.
At the moment, there's the service that's available. Obviously, all staff within a hospital or hospice or institutional setting are tasked with providing some level of pastoral spiritual care. But often, a lot of the medical staff are too busy to be able to provide that. So the chaplaincy team are the ones who step in to provide that service. Now, we have a population of people who are becoming increasingly non-religious. And we have a service which is provided almost entirely by religious providers, and they do an excellent service, and I'd really like to highlight that. But what's important is that there's an availability of people who are also non-religious. So those who find religion a barrier to accessing that care are more likely and more readily going to access that service. Recently, over the past couple of years, we've seen a growth in a number of paid staff in chaplaincy teams who are non-religious. There's now around 10 nationally, but this is only a very small amount compared to the large numbers of people who are working in that area. It's also worth remembering as well that a lot of the pastoral services are propped up by volunteers who do a fantastic job. But similarly, we only have around 200 volunteers who are out there in these different institutional settings supporting people, compared to the massive amount of religious providers. So what we really want to see is a service which has been responsive to patient needs and the changing demographics in British society.
The access to end-of-life care and providing good end-of-life care also means that it looks after a population that going through a very vulnerable time. And if you think of ways in which you can improve care and access for your most vulnerable population, then inevitably that will also improve care and services for everybody else. So if it's a good way of focusing the thinking about the group that is, if you like, most vulnerable, really. NHS England's role is about setting the direction of what we believe should be commissioned, how we believe it should be commissioned in order to achieve that care. Now, exactly the detail of that commissioning happens locally. But what we have done in NHS England is worked with our national partners. So in 2015, we produced together with our partners and published the ambitions for palliative and end-of-life care, which I shall now show you. And the ambitions for palliative and end-of-life care is different perhaps from previous strategies in that it is for all age groups. It is very much thinking about what are the outcomes we're looking for. And the outcomes we're looking for is that everyone is seen as an individual, that everyone has fair access to care, that we maximize comfort and well-being, that care is coordinated, so the joined upness that we were talking about earlier on. And to achieve that, we need staff who are prepared to care. And that means being prepared not just in terms of their skills and training, which is important, but also in terms of attitudes, behavior, and support from their employers, from their organization, from their managers, to be able to develop the resilience and support and supervision to be able to deliver that. And most of all of that sits within the community, so each community is prepared to help. So the ambitions framework is very much aimed at saying, actually, we all have a role in this. And the great thing about it too was that it was developed in partnership with organizations that not just in healthcare, but across with social care as well, and not just from the statutory organizations, but also the voluntary organizations with patients, who bring the patient and public perspective to it. So it's a very wide kind of partnership approach, which I think has allowed us to think in a very broad way. And I think as NHS England, we're very proud to be part of that. So what we now need to do is to continue driving that forward. There is another element of NHS England's work, which I think fits really well with this too, which is the whole emphasis on personalised care. And that, of course, is not just confined to end-of-life care, but end-of-life care is a great exemplar for what personalised care means. And personalised care means people having the opportunity to have shared decision-making, to have personalised care and support planning, to have choice, but choice that is informed and supported, possibly to access personal health budgets if that is what is suitable for them, and it will be suitable for quite a lot of people, to have the supported self-management and community support so that they can actually do a lot out there themselves and be supported by the community, and also social prescribing, which is really becoming something that is, that is proving to be very helpful and useful. Because really what we're trying to do with everybody is to try and support people who are going to be, who are facing the last year or years of their life to live as well as they possibly can until they die. Because that is what we all would want for ourselves, really.
In order to deliver high quality and effective palliative care, it's important that all staff in health and social care have access to education and training. Those of us that specialise in palliative care have accredited training programmes, and we keep ourselves up to date with the latest advances in the specialty. It's also a core commitment from us to deliver education and training to our colleagues working in other disciplines. This education and training can be tailored to their individual needs, for example, based on the setting that they work in and the types of people that they look after.
Mankind is growing in number and in age. By 2030, there will be 8 billion of us, with 1 in 8 over 65. In developed countries, the elderly make up a quarter of the population. Medicine and technology continuously hack the code of life so that we're not only living longer, but also better. But this demographic time bomb poses challenges for policymakers with growing pensions and healthcare bills.
We are seeing much more complicated mixtures of social need, intellectual need and capability, and practical and physical need. And I think the thing that probably frightens people most of all these days is not so, most people will say the thing I don't want to suffer is pain. That's true. But I think in the background there's also a fear of losing one's mind. And so dementia and the emergence of dementia as a recognisable entity is something that's a great source of worry to people. And also looking after folk who don't have a specific diagnosis but are just becoming weaker and weaker or frailer and frailer is another challenge. So palliative care and hospice is having to move into different areas like this. And certainly one of the things at St Christopher's that we see as an important pioneering work is being able to attune our palliative care to the age of the people we're looking after. The type of palliative care you provide to the frail elderly may be different from the type of palliative care you provide to people with cancer or teenagers who are coming into adulthood. So that's taking things on. We're at 50 years now since St. Christopher's opened. So there's a new chapter, there's a new generation almost. And one of the aspects that we are looking at particularly is how we look after the frail and the elderly.
I guess I have two thoughts about the ageing population. One, that we're in a very unsustainable, what's the word, situation, really. When there are surveys done, probably over 70% of people say that they would like to die at home. That isn't happening. Probably 20% of people achieve that. I think every possible effort needs to go into finding ways of supporting people to die at home. And that needs rethinking in terms of, care packages that can support that. Obviously, in terms of the doula role, we think that's pretty crucial as a consistent presence for that person, or maybe even two doulas working together. I think there needs to be a change of thinking about how we manage acute situations when somebody is frail and elderly or terminally ill, who may be at home and have what we would call an acute situation where they might have a collapse of some kind. And the current protocols around that for paramedics and medical staff are that they need to resuscitate somebody at this point, with very little consideration for their overall condition. And the kinds of resuscitation that we're talking about are CPR, which is, quite brutal. Chest compressions, electric shocks, and it's not the kind of way you would want to see your mum and dad die at the end of their life as a frail, elderly, or terminally ill person. So I really want to see a change in our thinking around how we support frail, elderly people to have a natural death without any kind of critical intervention. There's a group of doctors in North Wales who are geriatricians. They're so concerned about this issue. They've started a campaign where they're encouraging people to sign up for what they call I want to die in my own bed form. They've couched it in beautiful, simple language, ordinary, everyday language, no terminology. And they are trying to encourage and educate people that CPR is not a solution for ordinary dying. CPR is a great solution if you're younger and you've had a heart attack or you've had a cardiac arrest. But CPR is being employed when somebody is simply dying from many, many different, what they call morbidities, many different conditions that are leading them into frailty and potentially death. So this, I think, has to be radically rethought, because why are we doing this? What is the motivation? And I don't want to be callous at all, but this is costing the health service millions of pounds, and the success rate is extremely small. Less than 2% of people will come through that procedure and live for longer than a couple of months. So I don't understand why we do this.
Because I can only talk about my experience and my contact, I don't know, how it is in other places. I would hope that every area has its own form of hospice care or end-of-life care. And I suppose that all depends on the area you live in, the generosity of other people, how the fundraising is done. It all depends on who's running it and who's, the generosity of the people in the area.
Realities, which are that, poverty exists, class differences, racial differences, gender differences. People say that death is the great leveller. Well, it is. Everybody dies. No one can cheat death. But depending on who you are, what race you are, where you are, what class you are, what country you live in, you'll have a very different experience of dying.
So when palliative care started, when the hospice movement started, this was done exclusively through charity. There was a small amount of money that came from government to support institutions like the one I'm in at the moment, St Christopher's. And across the country and across the world, much of the care of the dying has been driven by charity, by the charitable sector. The health service doesn't invest very much in it. And what's happened is that in local communities, people have been dissatisfied with the deaths that their loved ones have had. And so they have started up charities in their localities to support and build hospices or to provide services in the community. And the government really is quite happy, I suspect, to leave them to it, because it means that there's a lot of care that's provided which doesn't cost anything to the NHS. For example, the majority of hospices get about a third of their income from the NHS. The rest of it is raised by local giving, by the community, and by grant-giving organisations of one thing or another, of one sort or another. And that's sad, because what it means is that you don't have a consistent level of quality across the country. Where you're in a rich community, that rich community can afford to fund a hospice. If you go to the inner city or you go to the deprived areas around the country where people don't have the money, they can't pay for those services. And so if you have services that are only available or largely available from charity, it's unjust. And one of the important things to say as well is that the amount of income that goes into providing care for the end of life is fractions of a % of the money that goes into the provision of the health service in general. I can't give you the exact figure, others will, but around 1% at the most of provision in research, and certainly fractions of a % in terms of the provision of healthcare actually goes explicitly to look after people who are known to be dying. And I think that that's a travesty. I think that's wrong. And I think that if society heard that, they would be ashamed. And of course, many people who give to their local hospices do it for that very reason. But it needs to be up there. It needs to be discussed as part of how we as a society are healthy and compassionate and how we look after our own. We can't do it all through the health service, I agree with that. But it seems rather odd that the health service looks after people who are sick, and sickness and dying is part of being human, and yet the health service does not prioritise the care of that group of people.
I used to be on the sea. Sin made you angry with me, but then you came close and tore that old veil. You said you were proud of me. We cannot forget, it's all about love, the love of the Father, Spirit and Son. No, we cannot forget, it's all about love, but we've been forgiven in perfect love.